The sun had barely risen when a garbage truck rumbled through the quiet streets of a small town. In the middle of its route, the driver noticed something odd, a small, beat-up cardboard box sitting alone on the sidewalk, far from any nearby house. It wasn't trash day, but something about the box made him stop. As he approached, he saw thick black letters written across the lid. "Don't want her." His heart sank. He knelt beside the box and gently lifted the lid. What he saw inside stopped him cold. Curled up tightly, trembling and covered in dirt, was a tiny wounded puppy. One of her ears was torn, her left paw twisted unnaturally, and her fur was matted with blood and grime. Her eyes, however, were wide open and filled with terror, confusion, and hope. She didn't whimper. She didn't growl. She simply looked up at the man as if to ask, "Why?" The man, James, knew at that moment this was no ordinary rescue. This wasn't just a case of abandonment. This puppy had been discarded like trash, left to die, labeled unwanted, yet somehow she was still fighting to live. What happened next would change not only her life, but his as well. And when the world heard her story, they broke down in tears. The box rattled gently in the passenger seat of the garbage truck as James drove faster than he ever had before. His mind raced as fast as the tires beneath him. He kept glancing sideways at the wounded puppy lying inside that battered cardboard coffin. Her tiny chest rose and fell so slowly, he had to keep checking to make sure she was still breathing. The words on the box echoed in his head like a curse. "Don't want her." How could someone write something so cruel? And worse, how could they throw her away like this? By the time James reached the veterinary clinic on the edge of town, his hands were shaking. He rushed through the doors, holding the box as if it were made of glass. The receptionist stood up immediately, her eyes widening as she took in the sight. "What happened?" she asked, moving toward him. I found her in a box," James replied, his throat tight. "Someone dumped her near a dumpster. She's hurt." The staff sprang into action. Within seconds, a vet appeared and carefully lifted the puppy into her arms. James saw up close for the first time just how bad it was. Her left paw was swollen and bent at an unnatural angle. Blood had dried around a wound near her ear, and her fur was filthy and matted. Still, her eyes were open, quietly watching people around her. She didn't cry. She didn't bark. She just lay there, silently enduring. While the vets worked in the back, James sat in the waiting room, heart pounding. He'd seen animals in rough shape before, living alone as a widower. He often watched documentaries about animal rescues, always moved but never directly involved. This was different. This was personal. He had found her, and she had looked at him. Truly looked, with those big, sorrowful eyes, like she had been waiting for someone to care. An hour passed. Then the door opened, and the vet walked out, pulling off her gloves. She looked tired, but there was a soft smile on her face. "She's stable now," the vet said. "Her paw's fractured, but not beyond healing. She's malnourished and dehydrated, but she's a fighter. She didn't resist anything. Just let us help her." James breathed out, not even realizing he'd been holding his breath. "She doesn't have a tag. No chip. No name." The vet continued. He thought for a moment, then said softly, "Hope?" The vet smiled again. "That's a good name." Over the next week, James returned to the clinic every evening after his shift. He'd sit next to Hope's crate and talk to her. He didn't care that she couldn't answer. Her ears would perk up when she heard his voice, and soon she'd start scooting closer, resting her chin on the edge of the blanket, so he could stroke her head. The staff noticed. One nurse even laughed and said, "I think she's picked you." He chuckled, brushing his calloused fingers to the soft fur on her neck. "Maybe I picked her, too." As the days passed, Hope's injuries began to heal. The swelling went down, her appetite returned, and one morning she even barked, just once, soft and unsure, as if testing her voice. It made James laugh out loud. That day, he brought her a toy, a small stuffed bone. When he handed it to her, she didn't know what to do. She sniffed it, pawed at it, then curled around it like a security blanket. James sat there for a long time, his heart both warmed and shattered. How many days had she lived without touch? Without safety, without love. Eventually, the vet told him she was strong enough to leave the clinic, at least for a short visit. James couldn't hide his excitement. He cleaned his house that night, setting up a small bed for her in the corner of his living room. He even bought her food bowls and a tiny pink collar. When he brought her home that Saturday morning, she walked in slowly, sniffing the floor, blinking up at the sunlight streaming through the windows. Everything was new to her. The sound of the washing machine made her jump. The ticking clock made her tilt her head, but she didn't seem afraid, just curious. James knelt down and patted the carpet. "Come here, girl." She limped over and sat next to him, her tail thumping once on the floor. He couldn't believe how natural it felt. Her presence filled the silence in his house, a silence he hadn't truly noticed until now. Since his wife died 5 years ago, it had been just him and the dull rhythm of routine. But now there was something alive in the room, something that looked at him like he mattered. Later that night, he posted about her on Facebook. A photo of Hope curled up beside her stuffed bone with the caption, "Found her thrown away like garbage." Someone wrote, "Don't want her on the box, but I want her, and I think she wants to live." He didn't expect much. Maybe a few friends would see it. But within hours, the post exploded. People from all over the country began commenting. Some shared their own rescue stories. Others offered to donate. Many were outraged. A few cried. Hope had become a symbol, a small, broken creature who chose to trust again. The next morning, James opened his inbox to find hundreds of messages. But one stood out. It didn't have a name. Just a short, chilling sentence. "She came from somewhere bad. Be careful. They don't like loose ends." James stared at the screen, his blood turning cold. He looked over at Hope, still sleeping peacefully in the blanket nest he'd made for her. She had survived something horrible, and now, it seemed, her story was only just beginning. James couldn't sleep that night. Hope lay curled at the foot of his bed, her breathing calm and peaceful, completely unaware that her very existence had stirred something deeper than pity. It had ignited a mystery. The message he received earlier kept repeating in his mind. She wasn't just abandoned. Be careful who you trust. He turned the message over in his thoughts, reading between the lines. Someone out there knew more, knew what Hope had suffered through, and perhaps even who had left her to die. But the tone of the message wasn't just informative. It was a warning. That terrified James. The next morning, while Hope gently limped behind him, her injured paw wrapped neatly in a soft bandage, James sat at the table, sipping coffee, his laptop open in front of him. He began looking into local cases of animal abuse, shelters with bad reputations, breeders with complaints. Hope jumped up on the couch, watching him, her ears perked. For once, she looked alive, not just surviving, but curious. He smiled at her, but behind that smile his heart was heavy. The address the stranger had sent him was only an hour away, an old, run-down farmhouse that had once operated as an unlicensed breeder. James had heard rumors before. The kind of place where animals were treated like machines. Females overbred. Puppies discarded if they were born with defects. The kind of evil that hid in daylight. Without telling anyone, James drove there the next day. Hope stayed behind at the clinic for her final treatment. The drive was quiet, and the road twisted through farmlands, fences broken, and weeds crawling through cracks. When he reached the farmhouse, he pulled over at a distance and watched. The place looked abandoned. Windows boarded up. A few broken cages were stacked near a decaying barn. The air felt heavy. James stepped out cautiously and walked closer. He didn't know what he was hoping to find. Clues, signs, anything. But something inside him told him he was close. Behind the house, he saw a burn pile. Ashes, charred wood, and melted plastic. But what stopped him cold was a small collar, partially burned, still intact enough to show a name. Luna. Not Hope, but another dog. Another life. Suddenly, the sound of a truck pulling into the driveway made him freeze. He ducked behind the shed and watched. 2 men stepped out, one lighting a cigarette, the other holding a shovel. They looked around, clearly surprised to see fresh tire tracks. "We had someone here," one of them muttered. James held his breath. He had no plan. If they found him, there was no telling what they'd do. The men walked inside the house. James sprinted back to his car, barely making a sound. As he drove away, adrenaline rushed through his chest. He knew now. Hope had come from here, and she was never meant to survive. Back home, he picked her up from the clinic and held her longer than usual. She nuzzled into his neck. That night, he sat by the fireplace with her curled beside him, and he told her everything. "I saw the place," he whispered. "You got out, little girl. You made it." But he couldn't rest. He knew those men would return, and if they had discarded Hope like trash, there were likely more animals in danger. James wasn't a hero, but Hope had become his reason to fight. The next day, he went to the authorities. He brought photos from the farmhouse, the burned collar, the cage remains. His Facebook post had already reached local reporters. Once he told his story, the media picked it up fast. By the end of the week, an investigation was launched. Police raided the property. What they found was horrifying. Dozens of shallow graves, bones, metal tags, burned documents. It was a graveyard of forgotten souls. Puppies' mothers, lives that never had a chance. But not Hope. She had survived it. She had escaped. And now, because of her, justice had a chance to reach the others who never did. James watched the coverage from his living room. Hope curled beside him, her head resting gently on his leg. The camera zoomed in on the box with the words still faintly visible. "Don't want her." But now the world did want her. They wanted her story. They wanted to know how a tiny puppy with broken bones and a broken past had brought down something so dark. She looked up at him then, licking his hand as if to say, "Thank you for wanting me." Tears welled in his eyes. "No, Hope," he said, smiling. "Thank you for saving me." The morning air felt colder than usual. James stood in his backyard, a steaming cup of coffee in one hand, his phone in the other, rereading the message for what felt like the 100th time. She came from somewhere bad. Be careful. They don't like loose ends. It wasn't just a warning. It was a threat. Vague, yes, but chilling enough to shake him. Inside, Hope was napping on a rug near the fireplace, her tiny chest rising and falling slowly. Her front leg was still wrapped in gauze, and her movements were cautious, but she was healing. She had even begun to wag her tail more often. But James couldn't relax. Not now. Not after what he had seen at that farmhouse. Not after the police found graves behind it. Hope wasn't just a puppy that had been tossed out. She was a survivor, a witness, even, and maybe someone out there knew that she'd lived. Maybe they wanted her story buried along with everything else. The media coverage had gone further than James ever expected. News vans now parked on the street. Reporters called him day and night. Some wanted interviews. Others offered money for exclusive rights. James ignored most of them. All he cared about was keeping Hope safe and giving her the kind of life she never had. But when the local sheriff stopped by the house one evening, James knew things were about to get even more serious. She was likely born in that illegal breeder's facility, the sheriff said as he sat at James's kitchen table. "We've arrested 2 men so far, but we believe others were involved, possibly part of a network that spans multiple states." James glanced at Hope, who was lying on the table, quietly chewing her new squeaky toy. She looked so small, so innocent, completely unaware of how dark the world outside had been to her. "I don't want her involved in any of this," James said firmly. The sheriff nodded. "She's not, but someone might want to make sure her story never gets out. I suggest you be cautious." That night, James didn't sleep. Every sound outside made him sit up. Every shadow felt like a threat. He double-checked the locks, pulled the curtains tight, and even set up a small camera by the front door. He knew paranoia wasn't the answer, but caution might just keep them both alive. The days passed slowly, but Hope continued to thrive. She followed James everywhere now, to the kitchen, the garden, even to the mailbox. When he sat on the porch, she'd curl up beside his feet, and when he looked at her, he didn't just see a puppy anymore. He saw courage. He saw light. He saw a creature that had every reason to be broken but chose to be whole. Then, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived in the mail, handwritten, no return address. James opened it slowly. Inside was a photograph of Hope as a newborn, lying next to her mother. On the back, scrawled in rushed, trembling handwriting, were the words, "She was the only one I could save." James's hand shook as he held the photo. Someone had tried to protect her. Someone, maybe even from inside that awful place, had snuck her out and left her where she might be found. The box wasn't a death sentence. It was a desperate act of mercy. He looked at Hope, who tilted her head and wagged her tail. Somehow, she had always known she was meant for more. James made a decision that day. He would tell her story, not for the likes, not for attention, but to honor the life she represented, the lives that were lost, the people who never got a chance to make it out. He contacted a local journalist who had been covering the case with compassion and honesty. They met at the park. Hope nestled in James's lap as he recounted everything, from the moment he found the box, to the clinic, to the farmhouse, to the letter and the photograph. The article was published 2 days later with the title, "The Puppy They Didn't Want, How One Dog Will Live Exposed a Hidden Hell." It spread like wildfire. Hope became a symbol of survival, not just for animals, but for anyone who had ever been thrown away, told they were unwanted, or made to feel worthless. Letters poured in from all over the country. People who had faced abuse, neglect, or trauma wrote to say how much her story meant to them. And then the donations began again, this time not for Hope, but for a cause James hadn't even thought of yet. The journalist set up a fund in Hope's name, Hope's Haven, to rescue and rehabilitate dogs from abusive environments. Within a week, they raised enough money to sponsor the rescue of 20 animals. James stood in his backyard one evening, holding Hope in his arms as the sun set behind them, casting golden light across the trees. She licked his cheek, and he laughed, a real laugh, the kind he hadn't felt in years. "I guess you were never unwanted," he whispered. "They just didn't deserve you." But deep down, a part of him still knew. The shadows hadn't gone away completely. Somewhere, the people who ran that dark operation were still out there, and one of them had warned him. He wouldn't let fear win. He had hope now, and he would protect her, not just with locks and cameras, but with truth, with love, and with the strength she had shown him every single day. She had survived the worst. Now, it was time to give her the best. It had been 6 months since James found the box. 6 months since the cruel, handwritten words, "Don't want her," nearly ended one innocent life before it even had a chance to begin. But now that same life, the one once left broken, bleeding, and hopeless, ran to the backyard James's home with joy, her heel paw barely noticeable as she chased butterflies beneath the golden afternoon sun. Hope was no longer the silent, shaking puppy who refused to make a sound. She barked now, loud and proud, when she heard the mailman or when a squirrel dared cross her territory. She greeted guests with cautious excitement and slept curled at James's feet every night, sighing peacefully into dreams that no longer haunted her. James often sat on the back porch and watched her. It amazed him how something so small, so fragile, had completely transformed not only herself, but him as well. The quiet, grieving man who once went through the motions of life without purpose now smiled more, laughed often, and looked forward to every new morning. Because each one meant more time with her. And Hope? Well, she had become something far bigger than either of them ever imagined. Hope's story had not just gone viral. It had started a movement, Hope's Haven. The fund, created in her name, had now grown into a full-fledged nonprofit organization. A team of volunteers, many of them survivors of trauma themselves, worked to rescue dogs from abusive situations, partner with shelters across the country, and fight for stricter laws on illegal breeding operations. James never sought the spotlight, but he attended the grand opening of Hope's Haven's first rescue center. It was a quiet, heartfelt affair. The ribbon was cut not with fanfare, but with emotion, surrounded by dogs once like Hope, scarred, abandoned, but now loved. He brought her with him that day, and when she stepped through the doors, tail wagging and ears perked, it was as if she understood. She sniffed each corner, met each dog, her presence calming, almost maternal. One volunteer knelt beside her and whispered, "She's like a little guardian angel." James smiled, his eyes misting. That's exactly what she is. But as life began to settle into something beautiful and new, James received one final piece of the puzzle. It came in the form of a knock on his door. A young woman stood there, holding a small notebook and a faded collar in her trembling hands. Her name was Kara, and her voice shook as she spoke. "I think you found the puppy I let go," she said. James's heart skipped. Kara told him everything. She had worked at the illegal breeders' facility for 3 months, forced into it by a distant relative after running away from home. She'd witnessed the horrors firsthand. Puppies thrown away for being sick, mothers overbred until they collapsed. She wasn't allowed to speak to the animals, wasn't allowed to care, only clean, obey, and forget. But she couldn't forget Hope. She remembered the day she was born, smaller than the rest, weaker, with a crooked paw that earned her the label damaged. The men in charge said she wouldn't survive. Kara was told to deal with her. But instead, she waited until nightfall, wrapped the puppy in a towel, and slipped out the back. She didn't know where to go, couldn't keep her, but she wanted to give her a chance. She left the box near the trash route, praying someone would find her. The label she wrote, "Don't want her," was meant to be sarcastic, maybe even a cry for help, anything to grab attention. "I didn't think anyone would care," she said softly. "But you did." James listened in silence, then gently invited her in. Hope patted over, sniffing Kara's shoes, then looking up at her. She didn't remember the girl, not consciously, but she didn't growl. She didn't hide. She simply sat beside her, tail wagging slowly. Kara burst into tears. James poured tea, and they sat for hours, talking about everything. The past, the pain, the guilt, and the healing. Kara had left that life behind, escaped the people responsible, and now volunteered at a local shelter, trying to right the wrong she had once been part of. Before she left, she placed a faded collar on the table. "I kept this," she said. "It was supposed to be hers. I couldn't forget her. I couldn't forget what I did." James nodded and closed her hand gently around it. "You didn't abandon her. You saved her. And in a way, she saved all of us." After Kara left, James knelt beside Hope and held her close. "You were meant to live," he whispered into her fur. "And now you're helping others do the same." The sun began to set, painting the sky in soft oranges and purples. Hope laid her head on James's knee, sighing that contented way she always did when the world felt safe. She didn't know she had become a symbol. She didn't know the pain she'd endured had sparked change, inspired thousands, saved lives. She just knew she was home. She was loved, and that finally, someone had wanted her. And James, for all the heartbreak and mystery and fear that had come and gone, knew that he'd been given the greatest gift of all. Hope. Not just the dog, but the feeling.